I'm Tara Wall. Welcome to Leading Voices. Today we're at the U.S. Department of State, where Assistant Secretary Linda Thomas-Greenfield leads the department's Bureau on African Affairs. Thank you so much for having us here today. We appreciate the opportunity to sit down with you.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and I'm delighted to be on your show.
Well, we know that the Bureau focuses on U.S. policy and development in the continent. We're going to get into all of that. We want to get to some of the most pressing news right now that's happening. Recently, U.S. airstrikes on Al-Shabaab in Somalia took place. An estimated 150 killed, said to be the largest among the suspected militants. Can you give us an update on this and the necessity, the urgency for the airstrikes?
Well, as a partner to the African Union and supporting the AMISOM troops, we have worked in Somalia with the AMISOM troops for a number of years. We were supporting their efforts, providing protection to them and to ensure that they did not continue to be attacked by Al-Shabaab. As you know, there were attacks against the Kenyan contingent a few weeks ago. There have been attacks on the Ugandans and the Ethiopians by Al-Shabaab, and we have tried to support their efforts to provide a secure environment for Somalis.
There were some, a lot of numbers went back and forth. Were the numbers as high originally as suspected? Is that something that's also ongoing? Are the numbers continuing to rise or decline in your view?
I will refer you to the Pentagon statement on that, where they gave a specific number of about 150, but they can give you more details on where those numbers are today.
And how do countries, when we have massive U.S. military and intelligence assisting countries like Nigeria, where you have Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, how have they not been defeated? How are we not winning supposedly in this war, some would see?
These terrorist groups tend to be very versatile. They change their methodology depending on where they are. But we feel that we are having an impact, certainly in Somalia with Al-Shabaab, but I also think that with the Nigerians' recent efforts, we are also having an impact on Boko Haram.
Yeah. Okay, well, I do want to get into a little bit of your background and why you're here, since we got the news out of the way. You have a 34-year career in foreign service, which includes an ambassadorship to Liberia and foreign posts in Kenya, Gambia, Nigeria, as well as an award for your work with refugees. Very impressive. So how has that shaped you for your current role here?
Well, I've spent most of my life working on Africa. I started as a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin studying Africa. I did research in Liberia, so it made sense for me to focus on Africa. But actually, for most of my career, while I was focusing on Africa, I concentrated on humanitarian affairs, which is why I got the award for global work that I did working on refugees in Africa. But I put a lot of time in my life on African issues, and this job made sense.
Yeah. Describe the four pillars. The Bureau talks about its four pillars: strengthening democratic institutions, supporting Africa, economic growth and development, advancing peace and security, and promoting opportunity and development. Let's take those one by one and talk about what these pillars mean. Strengthening democratic institutions. Obviously, that's number one, I think, for a reason. I mean, we have a lot more democratic countries in the continent. How do you help strengthen those and encourage more democracies, frankly?
Democracy is the foundation for all of these countries. And if these countries are to prosper, if they are to be peaceful, if they are to provide development for their citizens, they have to have a foundation in democracy. So that has to be our highest priorities. How do we do it? We support clean, fair, transparent elections. I just had a conversation with our ambassadors in East Africa. So Little Comores, we provided election observers at the request of the government. We provided election observers to Comores to ensure that we had voices to and people who were able to let the government and the people know what our views were on those elections. Nigeria, an extraordinary example of the Nigerians wanting to see their country have a smooth election. We were in the background. We provided capacity building for the Electoral Commission. We provided training for election observers. We were election observers so that the people of Nigeria could get what they wanted out of this election. We have supported elections in, one of the best examples is Cote d'Ivoire. 2 years ago, Cote d'Ivoire was on the verge of implosion. They'd had an election previously that had not gone well. And then this past year, they had a great election. And so we support those efforts because we know that's what the people of Africa want. Afrobarometer did a wonderful study in which they determined that Africans want democracy and they want transition.
Sure, but what about the leaders? Is that the hard part? Is that Africans want it, but some of the leaders, does that pose a challenge for you?
I would say the leaders are a little bit behind the curve on this, but we have a number of great examples where leaders are promoting democracy, leaders are changing and transitioning, and they're not changing their constitutions. Most recently, Benin had a great election. President Yayi Boni did not seek to run for a third term. He accepted the requirements of his constitution that he not run more than 2 terms. So we're seeing some positive examples across the continent, and we are heralding those examples and doing everything we can to support the examples. And where we have some disagreements, we're letting governments know that we disagree.
Yeah, I've seen some of that actually in some of your tweeting timelines. We'll get to that in a little bit, but you are actually, to pick up on that, I do want to get to the second pillar, and you could probably add on more to these than I could, but supporting Africa, economic growth and development, that you have as your second pillar. Talk a little bit about that.
That's about building economies so that people can have prosperity, so that they have jobs. So some of the things we have done most recently, the AGOA legislation was extended for 10 years last June, and we were really happy to have that because it provides opportunities for African companies to export their products into the United States duty-free. It provides jobs both in Africa but also in the United States. We're pushing investment by American companies. We hosted during the African Leaders Summit in 2014 a business forum that brought African businesses and American companies together with African leaders to look at opportunities. And that forum led to about $33 billion in new investments on the continent of Africa. We have Power Africa because we know that power, electricity, is really the base for which investments in businesses can do a better job of doing business. They spend a lot of money on electricity on the continent of Africa. So Power Africa is part of this initiative as well. Trade Africa, initially focusing on the East African countries. We're now bringing ECOWAS into Trade Africa. It's an opportunity to encourage trade and investment between African countries, which will create jobs, but also better investment opportunities for African companies to invest in the United States. Last week, I had an amazing opportunity to visit a South African company that's investing in the United States. It's investing in the state of Louisiana, a $9 billion investment in an ethane cracking plant in Louisiana. Jobs created in the United States, as well as jobs created on the continent of Africa.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. I know we do a lot to help, which is great, but how does that, it is a partnership, and sometimes the partnerships obviously need to go both ways as opposed to one way in some cases. The third pillar is advancing peace and security. And I know we talked a little bit about the Islamic militant situation. Talk a little bit about the importance of peace and security in many of these countries.
We've been working very closely with the African Union on the peace and security agenda, seeing how we can support their efforts to support African countries in achieving peace and security. Top of our agenda, of course, right now is fighting and countering violent extremism in the Horn, in northern Nigeria, in the Lake Chad Basin, in Mali and northern Africa. But also we're looking at countries like Burundi, where we're trying to ensure that that country does not continue to go backward. and continue to have a situation where thousands of people are being forced from their homes into refugee status in neighboring countries, but also that the killing in Burundi stop. We're looking at how we can support efforts to provide African troops, helping the African Union itself provide for some of the peacekeeping funding so that there is more reliability in peacekeeping support for African troops who are responding to these crises.
And someone see these groups as not particularly well organized, you know, so I think it's befuddling, I think, for some folks that, you know, they have these fits and spurts and we're just not able to wrap hands around it.
You don't have to be organized to kill people. And that's what they're doing. They are terrorizing and they are killing people. And it doesn't take a lot of organization to do that. But at the same time, we're seeing that they're becoming better and better organized as they connect to each other. Their strategies seem to be a little more well planned and well laid out. And so we have to adjust to that.
Speaking of, and this is not the fourth pillar, I'll get to that in a second, but speaking of, I mean, that since you have so much experience with the refugees, we've seen the refugee situation that's happening in Europe and in other places. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, how do you have so many Africans that are, you know, that we saw in these, that are, dying in the oceans, just trying to, you know, make a life for themselves and their families, you know, and other countries willing to take them, not willing to take them. What are your thoughts about that whole situation and scenario?
Well, I have two thoughts. One, that African countries have always been generous hosts of refugees, and we need to commend those countries. Ethiopia has 750,000 refugees in their borders. Kenya has more than 400,000 refugees. There was a point when Tanzania had 1 million refugees in the 1990s. And African countries have always been welcoming, supportive of refugee populations. Even when they occasionally will get frustrated, they've always opened their borders to refugees. So a refugee crisis is not new for us on the continent of Africa. The publicity on what is happening going across the Mediterranean into Europe. My challenge, and that's my second point, is to make sure we don't forget that Africans have been doing this for quite some time, and they have to be included and also recognized for what they have done to support refugees.
Mm-hmm. The fourth pillar, of course, is promoting opportunity and development, which is a great transition. How do you provide those opportunities to, you know, to keep these countries flourishing, people doing well, developing? Some of it you touched on, but how do you expand opportunities for folks that really see that see so much despair in some of these countries, not all, but some of these countries in Africa?
People do feel despair, but there's also a tremendous amount of hope in Africa, and we want to build on that hope. So we have a number of programs on the continent of Africa. The one that I want to highlight here is the Young African Leaders Initiative, where we are bringing extraordinarily ambitious and smart Africans to the United States, helping them to build on the leadership skills they already have, giving them more tools to help to support their countries. They are entrepreneurs, they are public servants, they are in the public and community support sector, supporting civil society, and we're helping them to harness those skills so that they can go back. We brought 500 for the past 2 years. 1,000 will be coming this year. And every time I've traveled to the continent of Africa, in whatever country I've gone to, I meet with these young people and they are still excited about the future for the continent, and we have to be there for them because they are going to be the ones that build the prosperity agenda for Africa. The population of youth in Africa in many countries are as high as 70% under the age of 35, and they're going to be around. We're not going to be there. They're going to lead this continent into the future. They're going to build opportunities. They are going to start the next generation of businesses that create jobs on the continent. They're going to be the next generation of teachers, college professors. They're going to be the next generations of politicians.
Yeah, politicians, techies. I interviewed recently a group of students at American University, all of them either from Africa or their parents, their first generation, live here. But at least half of the group I interviewed all want to go back and make a difference in their communities, in their countries. Some come from democracies, others, but I heard from so many that were either politics. I mean, the passion in these young people was just so encouraging. And I wonder if that, if we're really tapping into that, harnessing that, and helping to facilitate a lot of that passion in these young people.
That's what YALI is about. And our hope is that this will have staying power. In fact, I know that it will have staying power because it has had a major impact on the continent of Africa already. And we have a YALI network. On that network, we have more than 100,000 people tapping in all the time. They're communicating with each other. One of the great things about YALI is young people from Africa all across the continent are communicating on technology with each other.
Phones outnumber people, from what I'm told, on the continent. Yes. That goes to my next point. My next question is that one of the points you also make on the website, the Bureau's website, is that you are committed to demonstrable progress. What does that mean? How do you measure progress, and why is that important?
It's hard, but we have to measure progress. So we measure progress by looking at the number of successful elections on the continent of Africa, looking at how the middle class is growing, looking at the number of new investments on the continent of Africa, the amount of money being put into those investments. So there are a number of measures that we can use to determine that we are making progress, and I do think we are.
You made reference to the U.S. Africa Summit a couple years ago, and it's become a permanent feature, actually, I guess, in U.S. Africa relations. When and where will it take place next, and what other progress has been made? I know you talk a lot about YALI that came out of that, but are there going to be more? I know this administration is kind of winding down, but is it something that really is going to be a permanent fixture and people can see some of these demonstrable results from it?
Certainly YALI. And then Power Africa. There is nothing that has been bigger than Power Africa on the continent of Africa. Congress passed the Electrify Africa legislation, and that for us cements the staying power for Power Africa. But it's not just the U.S. Once we initiated this initiative, other countries and other entities have bought into it. The Africa Development Bank is a huge partner on Power Africa. The European Union has been a huge partner. Other countries are supporting the efforts because we know without electricity, Africa will not thrive. And the other area, of course, is education. More has to be done to promote education in Africa. It's the responsibility of African governments to support education, to invest money in the future of their young people from the early ages all the way through universities, and we are supporting those efforts as well.
What about efforts along the lines of education? It makes me think of women's empowerment. That seems to be something that's starting to bubble up too, and just empowering women in Africa. Are there efforts? Did it cover any of that, or do we see any efforts to continue to foster and grow that percent of the population?
Absolutely. We have a number of programs that we operate out of the Africa Bureau. There's AWEP, the African Women's Entrepreneurship program, that has brought hundreds of African women to the United States. They've gotten mentoring from American CEOs. They've gotten seed money from us. Some of the YALI programs where we try to ensure a significant number of women in those programs. I visited a project in Nigeria, a young Nigerian woman who was making animal feed, and she'd gotten a $25,000 grant from the African Development Foundation, African Development Fund, to support her business. And that $25,000, not a lot of money, had helped her more than double her capacity. She had hired additional people. She was not able to even meet the demand for her product once she was able to improve the marketing of the product. And then we have other programs. We Create is another program where we help African women entrepreneurs to improve their abilities to do better in their entrepreneurship programs.
So to clarify, will there be another U.S. Africa summit in your view?
I will recommend that. President Obama, I think, set the stage for this. There will be a new administration, and we certainly will recommend that to the new administration. And my hope and desire, and I think I can feel some confidence, given the success of the 2014 African Leaders Summit, that the next administration would want to do the same.
Because it was historic. I mean,
it was historic, and it was
to get that many, yes, and that many leaders, here in the U.S. at one time. Speaking of President Obama, another good transition. His recent visit to Kenya and to Ethiopia last year met with overwhelming excitement. Mostly, there was a tinge of criticism when he got there, when he started talking about some of the social issues that are unique to the United States as opposed to Africa, particularly the gay marriage issue. When you see issues like this bubble up, how do you balance the cultural differences without overstepping?
I think we have to stand by our values and support what we believe in, and then we try to influence. That's what diplomacy is about. If you took cultural practices as a bar from pursuing goals, we would not talk about female genital mutilation, for example, because 20 years ago, the response to that was, it's cultural, stay out of it. We didn't stay out of it, and I think we've had some major success in that area. Yes, we know that there are cultural differences, but human rights are not cultural. Treating people fairly is not a cultural issue. So what we are talking about is having the LGBT community's human rights not violated because of their desire to practice who they are. And so countries have responded, but we've also seen some successful results of those efforts across the continent. And I think the LGBT community across Africa has shown a tremendous appreciation for the efforts that we've made.
China, Russia, India, Brazil, other countries are seemingly have their eyes set on Africa in some ways because of all the mineral resources in the markets. How does the U.S. deal with the growing competition between us and some of the other countries in Africa?
I don't see it as competition. Africa is a huge continent. All those countries you name can probably fit on the map of Africa without going outside the African borders. So Africa is a huge continent. It's a diverse continent. It has tremendous opportunities, and there's space for all of us to help Africa grow. And that's the key, that we need to be contributing to Africa's prosperity, not taking the prosperity away. And what I say to African leaders is they have to determine that all of us are doing what is in the best interest of their countries. It's not for us to compete with the Chinese or the Indians or the Brazilians on developing Africa's resources. It's for African countries to determine what's in the best interest of their country and to make sure that we're not doing anything at odds with their own goals.
A couple more questions and we'll wind down. Freedom of the press is still an issue in some African countries. And you referred to this when you talked about Burundi, but you also recently tweeted, I wanted to get to your tweet, retweeted a State Department request that the government of Burundi lift restrictions on media to allow dissenting views and release political opponents. That was pretty powerful and strong. How and why is this still happening in a mobile society, do you think?
I think because there are countries where leaders don't listen to their people and where leaders don't care how their actions impact their people. So in the case of Burundi, we thought it was important that we get that statement out and that we continue to encourage that government, to encourage the president to open up to open up the country, to open up the dialogue. He is there as the president of all people, not just the people who elected him. He has to represent the interests of all. But in terms of press freedom, this is a core value for us across the globe. We promote press freedoms wherever they are being restricted.
We're thankful for that. And a lot of some would say a lot of the problems of Africa seem to focus from a media standpoint on human rights abuses, corruption, poverty, health, all those aspects of Africa, which are the negatives. And and someone would say we don't hear enough about the positive stories that are going on, the positive things that are happening in Africa. And I just want to know how the State Department, how you here at the Bureau are focusing on emphasizing some of those positives that are happening, and whether it's tech hubs, whether it's the new ideas that are being fostered. How do you communicate those, and how do you ensure that those those ideas and those things are getting out there?
We try to communicate those, but I'll throw that back at you and at the press, because bad news sells. And so the press tends to focus on bad news. So when we were having the African Leaders Summit, all of these leaders were coming into the building, and I did some speed dating with the press, and every single interview started with Ebola. So we were there to talk about the fact that we were having this historic summit in Washington, D.C. Leaders were walking in the door, and every question started with Ebola. Ebola was a huge crisis for us, but I couldn't get the good news outside of what was happening in the 3 Ebola countries. And I finally kind of lost it with the 4th person, and I can't remember which press organization it was. I'm like, I'm not here to talk about Ebola. Yes, we know it's an important issue. We want to talk about the summit and how we start building this continent's capacity to deal with issues like Ebola in the future. So it's part of our problem is the press, because you want to report the bad news. And
well, we don't.
Not you. Okay. All right. I'll give
Generally
you that.
speaking, yes, that's why we're here. We don't want to cover all the bad.
Yeah.
Finally, the administration the Obama administration, of course, is winding down. 2 questions in closing. What will be success for you personally come January 2017, and what will the legacy of the president be with U.S.-Africa relations in your view?
I think my success will be determined by the legacy of the president. I work for the president, and my goal is to ensure that his goals are achieved on the continent of Africa, and I think we have a lot to be proud of that I have been part of. I think the Africa Leaders Summit, to start with that, will be a huge part of his legacy. I do believe the next administration, whichever party, will want to continue with that. And that was one of the first goals that I got as I came in as Assistant Secretary in August of 2013, was to prepare for the Leaders Summit taking place a year later. The Young African Leaders Initiative and the Washington Mandela Fellowship for Young African Leaders, I think, is another one that I am extremely proud of. I have been a part of this from the beginning. We started with a small program in 2010 when I was ambassador to Liberia, where we brought about 200 young Africans to Washington for a meeting with President Obama. And this has morphed into this huge program that has buy-in across the continent of Africa, and we're getting positive vibes from African leaders. Initially, they were nervous. They were like, what are you doing with our young people? Now they see the benefit, and I think others will see the benefit, and it has bipartisan support on the Hill. So that is really a huge legacy that the Obama administration can be very proud of.
And would you say briefly that I've worked in government, so I know agencies sometimes can be at odds with one another over funding. Do you feel like you're sufficiently funded for the task that this Bureau has and needs to do? Or is it never enough in some ways?
It's never enough, and I certainly don't feel we are sufficiently funded. I raise that issue all the time. We never have enough money to do what we need to do. For example, on democracy and governance, you listed that. You recognize that as our highest priority. When you look at the pie chart of our funding, it's the smallest amount of our pie chart. I would love to have additional money to support elections, to support capacity building, to support training of voters so that we can have more good elections on the continent of Africa. I certainly would look for more money to support programs that build prosperity, that create jobs, that support education on the continent.
Okay, Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield, thank you so much for hosting us here at the State Department and for joining us on this edition of Leading Voices.
Good, well, thank you very much. And I look for your good news stories.
Yes. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again on another episode of Leading Voices. From the U.S. State Department, I'm Tara Wall, and you're watching Africa Today TV.